Okay, here we go. We are off to the races. We are going to talk today about mass media or mass communications modern day start, which was with the printing press. So we're going to talk about the earliest days of print, and if you open up PowerPoint 2, the history of print, you can follow along with me. The earliest days of print, um, we could really hardly say that these were mass communication devices, but right before the printing press, the way something would get duplicated is that the monks in the monasteries or in what we call scriptoria would hand print on parchment their beautiful writing, and usually the monks would illustrate these books, and these books would be the Bible. The Bible was the first book ever printed, not by monks, the first book ever printed by a printing press. The monks would treat the hides of animals into what we called parchment, and then China eventually developed paper, and it spread through the Middle East to Europe. In the Middle Ages, the invention of the first mechanical printing press was by German printer Johann Gutenberg in 1455. He invented printing with lead using movable type and pressing oil-based ink on paper with a converted wine press. He'd have a piece of paper, would go through the machine, and this press would come down, and on here would be metallic letters that could be moved around to spell different words, and then they would come down, they'd have ink on them, and they'd come down and press down and make the imprint on paper. Gutenberg died blind and penniless at the age of 68. In 2000, A&E's Biography Channel named him the most influential individual of the previous 1,000 years. How would you like to invent the best thing in 1,000 years and die penniless? Well, that doesn't happen these days. Usually people do nothing and they die very wealthy. So we have kind of the converse of what happened back in the 1450s. From the Renaissance forward, there was an increase in books available to the public, but most people were illiterate. Most people up through the Renaissance were illiterate. They could not read or write. Only Catholic priests and the wealthy could read and write. People could not understand the Bible until the Protestant Reformation, when new versions were printed in English and distributed widely. Before that, you would go to church and your priest would tell you what was in the Bible. Tell you what was in the Bible and tell you pretty much how to think about things. There were no books that people could buy to learn things on their own until the Protestant Reformation. In the early 1800s, textbooks played a major role in public education, but of course, we're talking a lot longer. We had to wait 350 years before that happened. And of course, with public education comes greater literacy. People in the Middle Ages, if they had a business, they would make a sign with no words on it. But if you were a bootmaker, you would have a picture of a boot on it, maybe with some thread going through it. And this was supposed to indicate to people that this was a bootmaker. If they had put words on these signs, they would have been useless anyway because people couldn't read. One of the first textbooks in America was the New England Primer. It's not primer, it's called Primer. 1688 by Benjamin Harris, which introduced children to the English alphabet, the basic principles of reading, and basic Christian values. So that's what you got out of the first New England Primer. And on slide 4, you see a representation of one of the pages from that. You learned A with this little phrase, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. And then B, heaven defined, the Bible mind. So everything stood for something, and it was usually religious in some way. G, let's see. Oh, I wish I could read that. Can't read it very well. All right, moving on to slide 5. We're starting to see, now that we can print things, somebody has to write these things that we print. So as literacy became more prevalent in America, the masses wanted to read. Excuse me. So it had to be accessible to the poor as well. So here comes the dime novel in paperback, sold for 10 cents. Well, that makes sense. It's a dime novel. It sells for 10 cents and became extremely popular. And the first dime novel was written by Anne Stevens. It was called Malieska, the Indian Wife of the White Hunter. It sold more than 300,000 copies in its first year. Now that's, even today, that is truly amazing. We hear all the time somebody just released a book today and next week it'll be #1 on the New York Times bestseller. In the meantime, people have ordered it before it's in print and it's going to sell over 1 million copies. But just imagine this. Just imagine back in the 1800s to have 300,000 people buy your book. We didn't have the kind of population on the earth or in the United States or in England back then like we have today. By the 1870s, dime novels included dramatic fiction, adventures, detective stories, and romances. On 6, the first English language newspaper was spelled a little differently than from the way we would spell it today, but it was called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. We didn't end domestic with IC, we ended it with ICK. Same thing with public, ICK. So this first English language newspaper was published in 1690. Think back, who is living around that time where the United States is now? We had colonies. We had our colonial people living. This was in Boston, Massachusetts. It was only published once, which is interesting, but more newspapers followed. It was published without British government permission. We have the First Amendment here today, but back then, the government had to approve everything that you wrote. Of course, that was Britain. That was England. This is America. The American colonial press took 2 forms, commercial papers and political papers. Politics was huge because the people in the colonies wanted to be independent of England. So there was a lot of politics being written about. When newspapers started circulating regularly in America, the average cost per issue was 6 cents. Yet that was still a high price because the average worker made only around 85 cents a day. So let's see, what would that be? All right, that's about 6 cents is 7.5%. Let's just say 7 to make it easy, 7%. Let's say if you're making $10 an hour, you make $80 in a day. What is 7% of $80? It's $5.60. Now, do any of you pick up a paper for $5.60? Anybody? Do I see anybody's hand? No, you wouldn't pay $5.60 for a newspaper. When USA Today first came out, it was a quarter. And what is it now? Well, the last I looked, it was 50 cents, but I bet it's almost $1 now. But it's a far cry from $5.60. So they were paying a huge price to get the news. So readership was limited largely to those who supported a certain political party, were well educated, and or rich. By 1750, most colonists could, who could read had access to a newspaper, although the elite remained the literate class. The lowly workers, they couldn't read. They couldn't afford an education. Here in America, our public education is free, basically, at least in grade school. We jump over to slide 7. The Boston Newsletter, Boston, 1704. John Campbell was publisher, published with royal permission. Was bland, had safe stories, poorly received by the public. They didn't want to read boring stuff, they wanted excitement. The New England Courant, published by James Franklin, who had a very famous brother named Benjamin Franklin, pioneers the idea that papers don't need official approval. Can you imagine that? Somebody coming out and say, why should I have to have approval to publish my newspaper? He was jailed for publishing without prior authority, and he appointed his brother Ben publisher, and under Ben's tutelage, it prospered.